Hello, my name is Margaret Adelle, and I love indie books. I don't think that's a secret at this point. Over half, if not up to 80%, and maybe even 100% some months of what I read is either self-published or published by an indie press. And I've been doing this for quite a while now. And I've noticed some things. Indie books, quality-wise, run the gambit from, oh my gosh, a fantastic 5-star favorite author, best thing ever, to you really thought this manuscript was the right one to publish? So because of that, it can be kind of difficult to gauge whether or not the book that you're looking at online is going to be the best fit for you or the best quality. So I've noticed a few things that can be sort of early indicators before you press purchase to decide whether or not that book is worth your time. Now, obviously, I am not a master reviewer. I am not the reigning expert on this. I don't really think there is one. These are just things that I've noticed that are either very effective or ineffective, and how you can use what little information you get to decide whether or not you should purchase that book. So we're going to start with the least effective method, which overall is like next to nil in order of gauging whether or not you should buy that book, except for very extreme circumstances, and that is the cost. Indie authors are aware that they do not have publishers and agents behind them. They don't have legitimacy in the eyes of the general public, however wrong they are, to price their books at the same level as traditionally published books. As a result, they are almost always going to be cheaper. In my experience, a book between 150 to 350 pages in a series is usually not going to run more than like $5.99 or $6.99. Now, that doesn't mean that books can't run a little bit more than that. However, if they're free, that doesn't mean they're bad. I've gotten some fantastic books off BookBub, and most indie authors will use free giveaways to generate interest and reviews for their book. However, if you see one that's really pricey, maybe it's an ebook for $15, that's probably a sign that the indie author isn't that clued in with the community or is very much overestimating their abilities. This doesn't necessarily mean that that book is poor quality, but it could be an early indicator that maybe that's not as savvy an indie author as some others, and maybe a book that you might have second thoughts about. But of course, once you start having those second thoughts, it's always good to keep researching and finding out more. So let's go on to our second method, the next up in effectiveness, and that is the cover. This again goes back to the issue of if it has a bad cover, it's not necessarily a sign of poor quality, because writing a book is free, and publishing it through Amazon, as I understand it, is also fairly cheap, if not free. Getting a very nice custom cover is expensive. So in this case, the answer is probably more of good cover equals a lot of effort put into the book and probably good quality, but bad cover does not inherently equal bad quality. The one you really want to look for, the type of cover that can really tell you the book's quality, is the specific art pieces made for that book. For example, I will use this one. This is Unknown Horizons by Casey White, the first in the Halfway to Home series. And as you can tell, I don't know if you can see, this is art made specifically for this book. Everything about this character you're seeing, from the mask to what she's holding in her hands, is a reference to something that happens in the book. It is not stock photo. It was purposefully made by an artist for this book. You can therefore assess that if the author is willing to work that hard to find the best art for the cover of their book, what's on the inside is usually pretty well supported as well. Now, some savvier indie authors, knowing that they necessarily don't have all of the money for fantastic art like that, will usually pick a halfway point. Sometimes stock photos, although those can be very risky if they're not photoshopped correctly. So my personal favorite and my biggest tip to any indie author trying to get a good cover on a budget is go simplistic. I have a couple examples of what I'm talking about here. We have Radiant Souls by Lene H. and Ascendant by Kimberly Gray. These are both very simplistic covers, black with a single white image on them. However, both of these images relate to something that happens within the book. In this case, a reference to a poem. In this case, a reference to the angel characters that are within it. It is very simplistic. It is very easy to tell exactly what it is, and it is your best bet if you can't go all out and afford a professional artist to do the work for you. Next up, our next method, and the third most effective, is reviews. Now, this could be very iffy depending on the kind of review you're looking at, because indie books tend to not have a lot of them. As a general rule, a longer review, like a blog post or a video, is usually going to be a better bet for quality than the 2 lines written on an Amazon review. Goodreads can also be a decent place. However, I think we all know how toxic Goodreads can be in some cases. And in generally speaking, whenever you're on an Amazon or a Goodreads and there's under 10 reviews and they're all absolute 5 stars, that doesn't necessarily mean that book is a 5-star. Generally speaking, if a book is self-published, especially if it's a debut or early on in the author's career, the first reviews are still going to be friends and family members. So as a result, that doesn't necessarily mean the book is bad, but it also doesn't mean that that perfect 5-star score on Goodreads is the best assessment of your enjoyment of the book. Now, if there's a book that's been out for a while longer, maybe they've been doing the rounds on BookBub for a couple years, and it has 50 to 60 reviews, that is usually a pretty good way to gauge it. In that instance, most people who review, I believe, will usually know that it's an indie author. And in most cases, once an indie author has gained somewhat of a following, they will have a lot of repeat readers. And so you can usually gauge how well their work is done based on other works, based on those reviews. But generally speaking, the longer the review, the more effort put into making the review, like a video or a blog post, the more you can use that as a gauge as to whether or not you're going to appreciate the book yourself. And I know this sounds kind of self-aggrandizing to put book reviews as the second most effective form of gauging an indie book's quality, because I do indie book reviews, but that's why I do them, because it's one of the best ways to say, hey, I'm going to talk for 10 minutes about this singular book. You should know plenty about it to be able to tell whether or not you're going to want to read this. So then comes our final method of gauging quality, and it is both simple and incredibly hard to do well, and that is quite simply the synopsis. Unlike traditional publishing, where someone else tends to write the synopsis or the bylines or whatever to draw in the readers, 99% of the time, the synopsis in a self-published book is written by the author themselves. Now, I'm not sure how often that's the case with indie presses. I don't know exactly how much control over the work the author has when they have an indie press, but for self-published, if you see the synopsis, the author wrote that. And this is one of the hardest things for an author to do, because you essentially have to summarize the book in only a couple paragraphs, giving all of the necessary information from the characters, the setting, and the main conflict, and maybe the main themes in a succinct way that will actually draw people in without spoiling anything. It is one of the hardest things to do, and as a result, a well-written synopsis will always stand out. And because this is written by the author, it's also a really good indicator of their writing prowess. If you're reading the synopsis and you find like 5 typos and the sentence doesn't really read well, that's going to be a decent indicator that the writing within the book may not be the best either. Now, these synopses will often sometimes spoil maybe minor turns in the story, and I've had it explained to me from indie authors that this is actually done because a lot of indie authors will actually check through a couple synopses. They'll write one, see how well it sells. If it doesn't seem to be selling well, they'll rewrite it, try it again. That's kind of the beauty of being an indie author, is because your name doesn't get out there right away, you can take a couple skips, a couple retries before you get it right. But as a result, this is the very, very best way. Me personally, I have a particular pet peeve for synopses that say things like just general, generic, vague words like magic, conflict, war. Okay, it's a high fantasy. No duh, there are those things in that synopsis. But the synopses that can very easily tell you, here's all the main characters you're going to be worrying about, here's the big things they're going to be facing, or at least the very general rule of the book. I know there are some books that I've read where the synopses had to focus more on the tone of the story because there was a plot twist very early on they didn't want to spoil. But in general, always look over that synopsis. If you really want to get in depth, check to see if it matches on Goodreads and Amazon, because a lot of times they'll be different. I know in a lot of cases, someone who is sending me a review request will actually give me a different book blurb than the one on Amazon. And I actually tell people to. I tell the people sending me a review, give me your best. If you don't think what was on Amazon is going to work, rewrite it. Because that shows a lot of effort, and that shows that they put a lot of effort into the book in general. So those are the 4 different methods of gauging an indie book's quality. Of course, none of these are foolproof. I don't want you to be going through synopses and be like, oh, there's one typo, it's worthless. These are all things to take into consideration together. Of course, if an indie author is more established, they're going to be a little bit better at writing synopses, or they're going to have better covers. So it might be a little bit more of a risk to read a debut. But I can tell you for a fact that there are some absolutely fantastic 5-star knock your socks off books within the realm of indie books. This list is just to help you find those ones specifically. With nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.